The mansion sat on the edge of town like a monument to wealth no one in the community could touch. White stone walls rose 3 stories high, trimmed with ivy that had been deliberately shaped by gardeners into neat patterns of control. Its windows glowed with a soft amber light each evening, not because the owner craved warmth, but because every corner of his life had been programmed for appearances. To those who drove past the long iron gates, the Alden estate was a dream, the kind of house that existed in glossy magazines and architectural tours. But to the people who worked inside, it was a reminder of how wide the gulf was between privilege and survival. Richard Alden, the billionaire who owned it, hardly noticed the hands that polished his floors or the eyes that saw his clutter. He lived his life behind newspapers and fine bourbon, locked in his study, speaking mostly to attorneys, accountants, and the occasional board member. He was a man in his 70s, tall but thinning, his once commanding shoulders sloped by years of disuse. His hair, silver white, gave him the air of a statesman, though those who had crossed him knew better than to mistake him for noble. He had built his fortune in real estate, buying up properties across the South, reshaping entire neighborhoods to suit investors while displacing families who had lived there for generations. He told himself it was business, not personal. But in his quieter moments, when the house felt too empty and the silence too loud, even he wondered if all his billions had cost him something that could never be bought back. Camille Johnson entered that world each morning with the soft dignity of someone who had no choice but to keep moving forward. At 43, she carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind forged by years of surviving not only poverty, but the dismissive looks of those who assumed they already knew her story. She was a black woman with warm brown skin and hair tied, back in a bun to keep it neat while she worked. Her uniform, simple pressed slacks and a collared blouse, was never flashy, but always clean. The job didn't offer much pay, but it offered something she valued more than pride: stability. Stability meant her teenage son David could stay in school. Stability meant groceries at the end of the week. Stability meant lights in their small apartment stayed on. David was 16, lanky but strong, his skin a rich mahogany that gleamed in sunlight. He carried his mother's intelligence in his eyes, alert, searching, always asking questions about how the world worked. His dream was to be an engineer, to design bridges and machines that solved problems people overlooked. But those dreams always collided with the reality of bills piled on the kitchen counter and the whispered doubts of teachers who treated him as though ambition was too heavy a weight for a boy like him. He visited his mother at the estate sometimes, sitting in the kitchen while she worked long shifts. He would do his homework at the back table, headphones in, his presence both comforting and guilt-inducing for Camille. She hated that he had to see her this way, scrubbing, polishing, bowing in silence to wealth. Yet he always reassured her, "Mama, I'm proud of you. One day, I'll take care of you." Richard Alden first noticed David in passing. He was a presence Richard had not authorized, a reminder that his private world had been breached by someone he hadn't invited. At first, Richard dismissed him as a nuisance, a kid waiting for his mother. But soon, subtle suspicion crept in. The boy's eyes lingered on objects, or at least Richard thought they did. He would glance at the ornate clock on the mantel, the leather-bound books, the glass cabinets filled with rare artifacts Richard collected on his travels. To Richard, raised in privilege and groomed to distrust anyone who hadn't earned wealth, the boy's presence carried the possibility of theft. Not that he had proof, but wealth had trained him to guard against shadows. He believed everyone, wanted a piece of what he had, even a boy with nothing but school notebooks and a second-hand hoodie. Richard's distrust hardened one afternoon when he returned from a business call and found his wallet on the edge of his desk, just a few feet from where David had been sitting with his homework. The wallet hadn't been moved, but Richard's eyes narrowed anyway. What if the boy had looked inside? What if he had thought about it? He told himself it was better to know now than later. He had built his empire by testing people, by prodding at their weaknesses until they revealed themselves. Why not test the boy too? Camille, unaware of Richard's thoughts, continued her work with precision. She wiped down counters, folded linen napkins into neat triangles, and swept the endless marble floors that echoed with every step. Her body ached at night, but she refused to let her son see the pain. To David, she was unshakable, the kind of woman who could lift the world on her back if it meant he could walk freer. To Richard, however, she was invisible. She blended into the background, like the furniture, necessary, functional, but easily forgotten. He barely registered her small smile when she greeted him, the polite, "Good morning, Mr. Alden," she said each day as though ritual mattered more than acknowledgement. But on that day, the day the test began, Richard lingered in his study longer than usual. He positioned his wallet on the desk again, fat with $100 bills, its leather worn from decades of use. He reclined in his chair, tilting his head back as though the weight of age had finally caught him. His eyes closed, though his mind remained alert. He wanted to see what the maid's kid would do when faced with temptation. Would he take? Would he hesitate? Would he prove Richard's suspicions right? David sat at the far end of the room, his pencil scratching against his notebook. He was working through equations, his brow furrowed in focus. The house was so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to amplify, each second stretching into a question Richard hadn't asked aloud. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of a man pretending to nap, but inside, his heartbeat quickened. He was waiting for the boy to betray himself, waiting for proof that his instincts were correct. For years, Richard had believed wealth insulated him from surprises. But as he sat in that chair, eyes shut but mind watchful, he had no idea that the moment was not a test of David's character at all. It was a mirror, one that would soon reflect the flaws of his own soul back at him. Richard Alden had always considered himself a master of human nature. Decades of negotiating contracts and bending men twice his age to his will had convinced him that he could read people better than they could read themselves. He claimed, to see the small tremors of greed in their hands, the flicker of hunger in their eyes, the way ambition slipped through cracks no one else noticed. To him, every person was a bargain waiting to be struck, a loyalty waiting to be tested. That belief had built him an empire and left him standing alone in a house too large for one man's footsteps. As he pretended to nap in his leather chair, his mind replayed the lessons of his youth. His father had been a steel magnate, cold and ruthless, a man who believed softness was weakness. "Never trust a man who's hungry," his father used to say. "He'll smile at you while stealing your plate." Richard had inherited that suspicion like a scar, invisible yet dictating his every interaction. It was why he never married, why friendships dissolved under the weight of his tests, why his children, born from fleeting affairs, had drifted away like leaves in a storm. He thought he was guarding himself from betrayal, but he had built a fortress so high that no one dared climb it. David, unaware of the storm behind those closed eyes, shifted in his seat. He was wrestling with a trigonometry problem, his pencil tapping against the margin of his notebook. Numbers came easily to him, but concentration was harder in this house. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. He glanced at the billionaire slouched in his chair, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The man looked older when he slept, or when he pretended to. For a moment, David felt pity. He had never seen someone so rich look so tired. Camille entered quietly, carrying a basket of freshly folded towels. She set them on the sideboard, careful not to disturb the stillness. Her eyes landed on her son, then on her employer. She read, The room instantly, the quiet tension, the deliberate staging of the wallet on the desk. The way Richard's body seemed too still, like a predator lying in grass. A mother's intuition sharpened her perception. She knew a trap when she saw one. Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. Her job depended on silence. Instead, Camille turned toward her son. "Baby, did you finish that essay?" she asked softly. "Almost," David murmured, eyes still on his notebook. She nodded and left the room, but her mind churned. She had seen this before, not here, but in life. Men who tested people just to prove their own suspicions, men who dangled bait to see if desperation would bite. She had lived through it when landlords slipped her envelopes of cash with strings attached, when foremen hinted at favors in exchange for shifts, when banks smiled at her applications, but never approved the loan. She recognized the performance of power, the way it reduced the poor into suspects simply for existing. But she also knew her son, and she trusted him more than she feared her employer. Minutes stretched into an hour. Richard remained in his chair, eyes closed, waiting for a rustle, a hand, a slip. But none came. David never glanced at the wallet, never shifted toward it. He scribbled equations, erased mistakes, and finally leaned back with a sigh, stretching his long arms above his head. To him, the wallet wasn't temptation. It was invisible. He had long ago learned to train his eyes away from things that weren't his. And yet, the moment Richard finally opened his eyes and caught sight of Camille returning with a tray of tea, something in his chest tightened. He had expected the boy to falter, to reveal the greed he was certain existed. But the silence had betrayed Richard instead. The boy hadn't failed the test. Richard had failed to prove what he believed. The realization sat bitter on his tongue, though he would never admit it aloud. "Tea, Mr. Alden," Camille said, placing the tray gently on the desk. Her tone was polite, practiced, neutral. Richard grunted his thanks, but studied her face. Did she know? Had she seen through him? The thought unsettled him more than the boy's integrity. For the first time in years, Richard felt as though he wasn't the one in control. That night, when the mansion quieted and the staff trickled out into the world beyond the gates, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the wallet. He hadn't moved it since the afternoon, but the sight of it mocked him. What did it mean that the boy hadn't taken the bait? Was it discipline, fear, pride, or something deeper? An honesty Richard could no longer comprehend. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and swallowed it in one long sip, but the questions lingered like ghosts. Meanwhile, in the small apartment across town, Camille sat across from David at their modest kitchen table. The apartment smelled of fried chicken and laundry detergent, warmth filling the narrow space in a way no mansion ever could. David was animated, talking about the engineering article he had read, his hands moving as he explained a new design for bridges that absorbed earthquake shock. Camille watched him with quiet awe. This was her son, her hope, her proof that struggle could produce brilliance. She wanted to tell him about the trap she had seen that day, about the way she had nearly stormed across the room to snatch that wallet off the desk just to end the charade. But she stayed silent. David didn't need the weight of her suspicions. He needed the freedom to keep dreaming. Yet deep inside, Camille's resolve hardened. She would not let Richard Alden break her son's spirit with his games. If the billionaire wanted to test them, then so be it. But she would not let him write the story of who they were. Richard Alden had never been a man to accept uncertainty. In his world, questions without answers weren't left to time. They were strangled, cornered, forced to confess. That was how he built his fortune, how he demolished rivals before they realized they were prey. So when his first test with the wallet yielded nothing, no faltering hand, no guilty glance, he convinced himself that it wasn't proof of innocence, but proof that his trap had been too subtle. He told himself the EI Boy hadn't taken the bait not because of integrity, but because the stakes weren't high enough. A wallet on a desk was easy to ignore. A more desperate temptation. That would reveal the truth. And so Richard began to scheme. The next morning, Camille arrived at the mansion with David as usual. The housekeeper's apron was freshly pressed, though she had slept only a few hours. Her son carried his backpack, textbooks poking out of the zipper, and his eyes lit up at the sight of the polished mahogany floors and the shelves lined with leather-bound books. For David, the mansion wasn't a cage like it was for Richard. It was a cathedral of possibility, proof that human beings could build beauty with vision and patience. "Good morning, Mr. Alden," Camille said softly as she entered the study. Richard, already seated behind his desk, raised his eyes but gave only the faintest nod. He was distracted, his mind already plotting the contours of his next experiment. He waited until Camille left for the laundry room before calling David closer. "Boy," he said, his voice gravelly with command. "Come here." David obeyed, standing at the edge of the desk with a mix of curiosity and unease. Richard opened a drawer, withdrew a thick envelope, and placed it deliberately on the polished surface between them. The paper bulged with cash, the edges crisp. He slid it forward until it touched the boy's fingers. "Count it," Richard ordered. David hesitated, eyes flickering from the envelope to the old man's face. "Sir, count. The money," Richard repeated, his tone leaving no space for refusal. David sat, carefully untying the string and spilling the notes onto the desk. His fingers moved with precision, stacking bills into neat piles. He didn't rush, he didn't linger. He treated the task like mathematics, objective, detached. "There's $20,000 here," David said finally, lifting his gaze. Richard studied him, waiting for a glimmer of longing, a slip of greed. But David's eyes remained steady, calm, like he was reporting the sum of pebbles instead of a small fortune. "And what would you do?" Richard asked slowly. "If I told you to keep it?" The question hung heavy in the room. David swallowed, then spoke. "I'd give it to my mom. She'd know what to do with it." The answer struck Richard like a blow he hadn't braced for. He expected hesitation, panic, maybe even excitement. Instead, the boy's voice carried conviction, not the hungry eagerness of someone who wanted to pocket the money, but the certainty of someone whose compass pointed elsewhere. "And what do you think she would do with it?" Richard pressed, his tone sharp. David thought for a moment. "She'd probably pay off some bills, maybe fix the car. But she wouldn't keep it if it wasn't really ours. She always says money that doesn't belong to you carries a curse." The room fell silent. Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. For a moment, he forgot he was pretending to test the boy. He felt like the one on trial instead. Later that day, Camille entered the study to find the envelope gone and her son quietly sketching bridge. Designs in his notebook. Richard sat staring out the window, his bourbon untouched. She felt the tension instantly. Something had shifted, though she couldn't tell in which direction. "Everything all right, sir?" she asked. Richard didn't answer at first. His jaw clenched, his thoughts tangled in ways he hadn't experienced since his earliest battles in business. He had wanted proof of weakness, but what he had found instead was resilience, and it unsettled him. That evening, when Camille and David left the mansion, Richard stayed in his study long after midnight. He walked the halls, their silence echoing, with memories of his own childhood. He thought of his father's lessons, of suspicion as armor, of wealth as fortress. But for the first time, he wondered if mistrust had cost him more than it had saved. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender. One test was inconclusive. 2 might still be chance. But 3 would reveal the truth. Or so he told himself. And so Richard began planning a third test, this one not aimed at the boy but at Camille herself. Richard Alden had always believed endings were written by the strong. In business, in politics, in life, those who dictated the last move owned the whole game. That belief had made him ruthless, had filled his vaults with wealth and silenced competitors who thought they could outlast him. But as dawn crept through the high-arched windows of his mansion, spilling pale light across marble floors, Richard felt something unfamiliar pressing on him. Not victory, not certainty. It was doubt. He hadn't slept much. He had lain awake in the great four-poster bed, staring at the carved oak canopy, while Camille's son's words replayed in his head. She always says money that doesn't belong to you carries a curse. For decades, Richard had lived under the opposite creed. Take what you can before it's taken from you. But that voice had come from his father, not from any inner compass. And now, here was this boy, this Maid's son, carrying a truth that had survived poverty, discrimination, and all the cruel weights of the world, a truth that rang purer than all the hollow victories of wealth. Still, Richard could not leave. Things unfinished. He had tested the boy. He had tested temptation. But there remained one last experiment, the one that had gnawed at him since Camille first entered his household years ago. Would integrity survive when dignity itself was on the line? That morning, Camille arrived as usual, greeting him with her soft, steady voice. She didn't know he had been watching her for weeks more closely than ever, studying her movements like a scientist studies an element he cannot quite classify. David followed her in, slipping his backpack into the corner, already preparing to do his schoolwork at the little table Richard had begrudgingly allowed him to use. Richard called Camille into the study. His cane tapped the floor as he circled. Her, a predator pretending not to stalk its prey. "Camille," he said slowly, "I have been thinking." "Yes, sir?" "You've worked here many years. You've kept my house in order. You've raised your son under my roof more than under your own." Camille nodded, cautious. "I'm grateful for the work, Mr. Alden." Richard let the silence stretch until it felt like a weight pressing between them. Then he placed a slim black folder on the desk and slid it toward her. "Inside," he said, "is a deed to a house. A real house, not an apartment. Brick with a garden in back, paid in full. The deed could be yours. All you would need to do is sign a new contract." Camille's brow furrowed. "A new contract?" Richard's eyes gleamed. "One where you agree to remain in my service exclusively for 10 years. No other employment, no leaving, no independence. In essence, you would belong to this house, but your son would never worry again. His future would be secured." The words landed like chains, and Richard watched her carefully, expecting the hunger of security to wrestle with the sting of captivity. Camille did not touch the folder. She did not even glance at the deed. Her eyes lifted, steady and calm, though there was an ache behind them. "Sir," she said softly, "I have scrubbed these floors, washed your linens, and cooked your meals. I've done it with dignity, because honest work is not shame. But I cannot sell you my freedom. Not for a house, not for 10 houses. My son must grow up knowing his mother chose integrity over comfort." Richard's throat tightened. He had expected bargaining, hesitation, even anger. But not this. Not words that echoed with the same moral certainty as the boy's. "And what? Of your son?" Richard asked, harsher than he intended. "What if this costs him the chance to escape the life you've lived?" Camille's voice did not waver. "Then I will teach him that escaping poverty at the price of self-respect is no escape at all." The silence that followed was not empty. It was thunderous, alive with the collapse of Richard's final test. His cane slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, and for the first time in years, he did not care to retrieve it. David, hearing the noise, rushed in. "Mom? Mr. Alden?" Richard looked at the boy, then at the mother, and something inside him cracked. Not with the violence of collapse, but with the slow yielding of stone under water. He realized he had not been testing them at all. He had been begging them, begging the universe for proof that goodness still existed. Proof that he had not wasted his life building walls of suspicion only to die alone behind them. And now, here it was, in a maid's courage, in a boy's honesty, in the quiet refusal to bow before wealth. Richard sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his years. He gestured weakly to the folder. "Take it," he whispered. "The house is yours. No contract, no chains. Just take it." Camille's eyes widened. "Sir, Don't argue," Richard said, his voice rough. "You've already passed the only test that matters. You've shown me what money cannot buy." For a long moment, no one moved. Then David stepped forward, resting his small hand on Richard's frail one. "Thank you, sir," the boy said. "But you don't have to give us anything. You've already given me something more important." Richard blinked, bewildered. "And what's that?" "A chance to prove who we are," David answered simply. The old man closed his eyes, fighting the burn of tears he hadn't shed in decades. For the first time he felt not like a judge presiding over others, but like a man finally judged and forgiven.